Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Tuba People TV, where we talk about Arnold Jacobs all of the time. I'm up here in Westlake, New York. Is that correct?
Westfield.
Westfield. Westfield, New York, with a tuba legend, Mr. Toby Hanks. And this interview, for me, is very special because it was Mr. Hanks who inspired me to play the tuba back in 1977 when I heard him with the New York Brass Quintet. My band director, Jim Little, and my brass teacher, Mark Walters, got me tickets to go hear you. That was a really memorable thing. I had been sort of laboring away on the tuba for a few months, but I was just thinking it was oompa oompa, and then I heard you play. And that was it.
Well,
so welcome.
thank you.
It's great to see you.
Thank
Great
you.
to see you.
Thank you.
And along the way, you had studies with Arnold Jacobs. I wonder if you can recall how you got started with that.
Sure. As much as I can remember, it's a few days ago, to say the least. But I was about in my freshman year of college, and down in Beaumont, Texas. I was going to Lamar College of Technology, where I was a music major, freshman. And a good friend of mine knew somebody in Beaumont that I forget I think his name was Bill McNeiland, I think. But he played a little tuba and he played bass, and he'd been in the service or something, and maybe in one of the Army symphonies or something. And my friend Early told me I should go talk to him because he was a smart guy and he's a little older, and maybe he'd give me some ideas about how to pursue music and tuba and stuff, because I was a music major in college, an education major. So, sure, okay. So I went over to contact him. He was visiting his home, and I went to visit him there, and we just talked, rambled on about this and that and the other. And he's the first one that mentioned the name Arnold Jacobs to me. I'd never heard of the man. I've heard of the Chicago Symphony, vaguely. Beaumont's not the hotbed of orchestral appreciation, if you follow me. But he started telling me about Arnold Jacobs, and told me how great he was, and how people that have studied with him have made sometimes astounding progress. And he was teaching in a way that, as far as he knew, had never been taught before. And I can't remember exactly how he described it, but somehow he persuaded me that this is what I wanted to do, is to go to Chicago and study with this man. And he warned me to don't write him a letter or such thing, because he won't answer it. Call him on the phone and ask him if he's got room to teach you, and go from there. So I don't know how I found his phone number, or maybe perhaps information in Chicago. I don't recall. So I called him, and he says, "Sure, come on up." I can't imitate his voice. He had this deep, resonant, authoritative kind of voice.
Yeah.
If he said goldfish or blue, I'd have probably believed it. How could you argue with that voice?
Yeah.
So anyway, he said, "Come on up and call me when you get here." So my parents said okay. I got in my 1946 Plymouth. This was in 1960. I graduated in 1950, about 1960. Maybe.
1960?
1960 or 61. And I left early in the summer, planning to stay all summer and take lessons, or as long as it worked out.
Wow.
And I knew I was going to have to get a job when I got there and all that, because $60, $75, whatever I had, was not going to go that far. It might give me gas to get there. But I must have had it figured out, at least getting there. So I got there and called him up and told him I had to find a job so I could stay. So I fiddled around, tried to sell encyclopedias to no avail, and I did this and that and the other, but I finally found a job, and a place to stay. I found a room in the Illinois Institute of Technology on the campus in a dormitory.
Wow.
That was vacant, and they wanted to rent a little space out, the dormitory beds and stuff, just for $50 for the whole summer, just to keep the electric bill paid
Mm-hmm.
or something. And there was, a few men in there. So that's not related to Jake though, but that's what I did. And wound up working in a pillow factory, stuffing pillows and putting them in boxes and packing the boxes and taping the boxes and throwing the boxes on trucks and stuff. You can imagine how much it must have paid. But anyway, then I finally went out to Jake's house and found my way out there to, where did he live on?
South Normal.
South Normal, of course. South Normal. So I got out there and went downstairs to his studio, and we got started. And he was rather complimentary at first, he was complimentary. It was the kids, and I was doing pretty good, I guess. Of course, then came the but. Could do it a lot easier. So
you're working too hard.
So I'm working too hard. You can do twice as much if you do half the work. I don't know if that was his exact phrase. It has been a few days since I've talked to him. But so I blew into tubes and measured the rate of flow and played my horn and he had a little sound meter.
Mm-hmm.
We called it the Christmas tree.
Yeah.
It would go up and the lights would come on if you play a note and get the sound up to here. And he'd try to get me to do that with less effort and that sort of thing. And he told me his ideas about respiratory function, which were different than I had been taught. And I just listened there. And one of the things, he wanted me to play some music with him, and I didn't have much music, and he used to work out of 2 French horn books.
The Patek books?
Patek books. And I didn't have any extra money, so actually he bought them for me.
Oh my gosh.
Between my first and second lesson, he bought them for me. And he had a break, a rehearsal or something, went over and gave them to me. I think I paid him, I'm not sure, or maybe I didn't. And I don't, if I recall, I'm just now remembering, I don't think he charged me at first for my first couple of lessons, because he knew I was broke. And he treated me very nicely, and I don't know, he just went into this respiratory function, and he spoke with his authoritative voice, and which, like anything he said, you had to believe, and with good reason, is beyond just because he has a smart sounding voice.
Mm-hmm.
Because the things he said have proven to be, to my mind, all accurate. I can't think of a thing that he told me that was not accurate, helpful, and on point.
With when you mentioned the respiratory stuff, what was it in working less? Do you remember anything specifically what he had you do, or?
Well, he just showed me how, I had come to the fairly common opinion of brass and wind players that you stick your stomach out and make it all tight and everything, and that was what gave you breath support. And he persuaded me in about 10 minutes that was not the case, and he demonstrated and showed me how and explained why. Because the way the lungs work and the diaphragm, and the word diaphragm back in those days used to be used all the time. Use your diaphragm, use your diaphragm. He explained to me how your diaphragm is an involuntary muscle, that you don't have any direct control of your diaphragm except by breathing and blowing. When your lungs empty, your diaphragm goes somewhere, and when you blow out, it goes back to where it started. Mm-hmm. And he explained all that in detail with me. I'm not sure I could explain it, but whoever's interested in this probably knows all about that. And he had me blow in some tubes and get the little balls in the tubes up to some numbers, had numbers on it, and he would change the resistance of the blowing, where if I blow real easy, the ball would jump to the top. And other times I blow as much air as I could, and it could hardly get it to move. Mm-hmm. Now, actually, I forget exactly what he was trying to show me with that, but I just remember the little instruments that he was working with.
Maybe he was trying to separate shades of gray into black and white for you.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it all made sense at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing I most got from it was the thing. It took me a while to get it. He used to talk about the psychology of playing, and I thought he was talking about if you're all uptight, if you're nervous or you're nervous about a performance, and he actually didn't get that through to me, or at least I didn't get it at first. But I soon came to realize, at some point came to realize he was talking about not emotional thing that a psychiatrist works on. He's talking about what you think of when you're playing, what your mind is doing, and rather than having your mind be thinking about some action you're trying to get your diaphragm to do, you just think about what you want to sound like, and your body, with training and practice and development, takes over and will give you that. And you don't have to know how it's happening. You just, it's unnecessary to know. And he proved that so many times because he would demonstrate. He'd go boom, 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 boom. He had a way of playing that actually would not quite fly today by today's performance standards, but it worked very well in Chicago Symphony, and it was so efficient. You could just hear the efficiency and the tone and the effortless way he made it. And so he'd play something, and he'd want me to play it right behind him. Well, first I'd play something I couldn't play, I was having trouble with.
Yeah.
And he'd say, let me demonstrate. And he would play it. He said, I want you to imitate me exactly. And I would try. And so I didn't always just get it right away, but pretty soon I'd get a lot closer. And then he finally explained. He was a little slow at explaining this, but what a lot of people misinterpret, that he wanted everybody to play exactly like him, he did not. He wanted people to play as effortless as he, and the idea was if you could do this, you could do that. And because when I imitate him right behind him, usually it was better, if not okay. I mean, I could do it, and I couldn't do it before. And so he started talking about, how when you whistle, how'd you do that? How'd you change those pitches? How'd you learn to do that? I don't know. How, you don't know? Do you do something with your lip, your tongue, what? I don't know. He says that's the way you should play the tuba. You should have clear in your mind what you're trying to do, and quite specific. And sometimes you think in general terms. Sometimes you're specific about an attack or some little detail.
Right.
But in general terms, as you develop, you should be playing as unconscious of your physical maneuvers as a whistler or singer. Sing Mary had a little lamb. How'd you do that? I don't know. So I'm repeating myself here. But he showed me, and I didn't get it right away.
Took you a while?
It took me a while. And he'd take some of those little potag things and little style he had.
Yes.
He said, do it just like me. And I could always do it better than I was doing before.
Yeah.
Not better than he.
When you imitated him.
When I imitated him, I could play the thing better than I could do before. He would pick something that I was struggling with a little bit, and it always got better. And he'd wonder how I did that. Quote. Ooh.
Yeah, right.
He says, well, you don't need to know. All you did, you try to imitate me. And if you have a different idea, fine. Just think of it while you're playing.
So he in those initial lessons, he really got you to rethink how you were thinking.
He started right in on it and never gave up on it. And I studied with him all that summer. And then I went back, took a couple of lessons the next summer. And then throughout my career, when I used to travel around, when I was in Minneapolis in Symphony, myself and the bass trombone player Larry Weinman used to drive to Chicago, spend a few days. We'd both take lessons. And then when I was traveling around with the brass quintet, anytime we stayed in Chicago, if I could get a lesson with him, if he had time, I'd go take a lesson, and I did that throughout my whole career. I never stopped studying with him.
Yeah. So what kept coming back all those years?
Because I always felt there was something more I could learn from him. And I liked him personally. He was a little bit of an oddball, socially speaking. Mm-hmm. I could tell you about a couple of those social exchanges. But I always felt that I'd go in there and play for him, and he'd reorient me to his thinking. And his thinking was not, 10, 15 years later, it was not exactly the way it was when I first went there. It kept evolving, and he found different ways to say what he meant, and he might even have changed what he thought a little bit, but I can't say that for sure.
But what are your observations on that? That's very interesting. On that pedagogical evolution.
Well, I can't really articulate it,
okay.
but it was always, he didn't just have a mantra that I came in, I'd go la-di-da-di-da, he'd say the same thing that he said to me 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
He'd say something different somehow, and I can't articulate it any better than that, because I think he was a learning person. He never stopped studying his field, I don't think.
That was certainly my impression. He was always up on the latest journals.
Absolutely.
Medicine and psychology especially.
Yeah. And this, what he referred to as, this, like I mentioned before, the psychology of playing was probably the most, it's equal to this breathing expertise, which he doesn't coach just tuba players, he coached singers and oboe players and just anybody that used wind to play something. I think he understood about it and how their instruments worked to give them helpful suggestions on how to make it easier for them. And I've heard some people say they thought it was a little bit on the pompous side, but I never found it that way.
Mm-hmm.
I found he's like my grandpa or something,
mm-hmm.
Or at least a favorite uncle. He always was nice, friendly, and
this is Yellowtail. Say hi to the camera, Yellowtail.
Say hi, Yellowtail.
Well, do you suppose that with his studying, that was it was just such of such great interest to him?
Oh yeah. Oh,
he just couldn't stop.
Oh, absolutely. Compulsive, maybe even, for all I know.
Mm-hmm.
But he was interested in the subject, and he was onto something that he believed in, and was confident of his what he had learned. And I think it was very interesting for him to try to articulate it and convey it to students, because he looked around and see how much struggling people do, and how hard people work. Even if they're getting good results, they're working harder than they ever need to play, and he could help. If he could help them ease off on the physical things just by doing it more easily, you get a better result. Because he didn't analyze himself to figure out how to play. He went to the hospital and with the cadavers and studied the respiratory process.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't play him, like I say, he didn't self-analyze, because he somehow figured out long ago that that's not going to work. You cannot self-analyze this. So he sat very close to one of the best trumpet players that ever walked the face of the earth, maybe, Bud Herseth, and some other great players in that orchestra. And he studied them.
He did, yeah.
He studied them, how, not what they said, but what they did.
Right.
And incorporated all that into his knowledge, and began to articulate it in a way that nobody ever had. And I've never found a thing that he ever told me to be in error.
When you first started studying with him, that was in the early 60s, did he have any weird machines? Like, I remember there was reports of like a fluoroscope machine or...
Yeah, that's the one I was talking. Larry Wyman and I used to call it the friendly tree.
The friendly tree?
So he'd say, blow the ball up. I think sometimes we blew in a tube and it just blew air into it, and other times there was something that it reacted to tuba sound.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
But
if
not an
it's-
X-ray machine. He didn't have an X-ray machine in the house.
No.
Oh, okay.
If he did, he didn't show it to me.
Okay.
But you play a note. He said, blow the light up to, red. Da, didn't quite get there. Da, you get a little lighter, and then now just blow it up to yellow, which is, I'm just making up the colors, and you blow a little softer. And it's amazing how we could try to pay attention to not the notes, to the lights, and trying to put that much air through. How much easier it was.
But weren't you working harder to get those?
No, that's the whole thing. Everything he had me do, and as far as I know, everybody else that I talked to, the idea was don't work harder, work less hard. And he always had this. He had this little machine. I'll digress a little bit. Where you blew into the tube, and it reacted. The machine, the what do you call it? The face of the machine, the little ball. You could he could manipulate it with how much resistance he created with his thumb on a little tube, and if you just blew it real easy,
yeah,
the ball would shoot up to the top.
Right.
And then he could open it up and make the airflow better, and you could blow as hard as you could. You could hardly get the thing to move.
Mm-hmm.
And he had to study how that felt. Somehow, not to analyze it, but just how it felt. And then he wanted me to try to play louder. And he said, well, blow the ball up to line 7 while you're trying to play this note. And try to duplicate that feel. And I blow, and it was wide open, and all of a sudden that note that I was having a little trouble playing loud, all of a sudden it jumped up noticeable decibels.
So when you applied trying to get the ball, what you did to get the ball to line 7, apply that to the tuba.
Yeah, he tried to get us away from the instrument and perform certain things, blowing with different resistances and blowing softly and slowly, blowing a lot of air through with all kinds of resistance, with no resistance, and then we try to emulate those procedures through the tuba, and it's amazing how much more efficient our playing got. Just from that little few moments of fiddling around blowing in a tube or something. He wanted to imitate that thing, and all of a sudden it was easier to accomplish on the tuba what had been harder before.
Mm-hmm.
And then he would go into lectures, which I can't duplicate all he said, to explaining to us how all that worked, and that we should work to minimize our work efforts, not maximize our work efforts. If you can't play loud enough, try to just move air. Don't try to get your body like a wrestler. It's like, oh. And the closer you could come to that, the better the results you're going to get. Work less, get more.
Yeah.
Not just volume, but that's a big part of it.
I remember him saying minimal efforts, maximum results.
Yeah.
I also remember him saying that in an interview in '84 where he was asked the question, what's the commonest issue that he observes in students, and then he replied with unnecessary tension states.
Yeah.
Just working too hard.
Yeah. He was very, he used to talk about the isometric contractions. He used that word all the time, that phrase all the time.
Yeah.
And, just pushing against the door that's not going to move.
Right.
And it's an unnecessary effort, and it creates no result. And the idea is you decrease the work efforts and you increase the responses that you're looking for, particularly volume, range, all that stuff.
Yeah.
He was very friendly to me, after a lesson sometimes he'd sit up and drink coffee with his wife up there in the dining room. We all walk through, and sometimes there's another person sitting in the living room on the couch there ready to go for the next, downstairs to the next one.
Yeah.
And
what was the do you recall any reaction to some of your other friends or other professionals that, when you tell them you're studying with Jacobs, this starting there in the 60s, was there any pushback on that, or he doesn't always talk about that?
Well, I'll tell you one thing, not pushback, but after that first summer, I went back and did my second year in college, at Lamar College, and quite a few people, sitting in the band room warming up, said, "Whoa, yo, man, you just sounding good. You didn't play like that last spring or whatever it was." But people noticed the difference in my playing, the sound and the work efforts and stuff. It was clearly noticed by almost all of my Lamar colleagues.
Yeah.
I'll never remember.
So that was affirmation. That was
affirmation because I could hear the results myself.
Yeah.
And I could feel it, how much freedom I was on the path to obtaining, and never did quite get as free as I'd hoped. But anyway, when my college colleagues just started, noticing the difference, boy, I felt even better because you wonder, you think you're sounding better, but are you? So it's easier, but does it sound any better?
Right. So he had you doing a lot of imitation,
yeah,
a lot of working with just getting the good balance between effort and relaxation. And then what about, did he have you singing in your lessons or playing the mouthpiece?
All that. The rim, the mouthpiece, he had me sing, trying to get my brain to create in my mind what I wanted to play. Bing, bom, bing, da-dum, bom, bom, bing, bom. You do it now.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny how I could do it right behind him. I mean, not quite like he could do, but better than I could do before.
Right. So just that.
And it was just he said, "See, you just had a better picture in your mind. Nothing wrong with your lip. Just you got to think, create it right here." He did tap on my head once in a while.
Uh-huh.
Unhand me. No. And
I know he'd tell some students, he'd say, if you could put my brain with your lips, you'd be fine.
yeah,
So it's not your lip.
yeah.
It's just what you're doing with your mind.
What you do with your mind with somewhat the respiratory function also assists the physicality of it. But start here. You got to have something in mind.
What years were you in Minneapolis?
I think from about 64 to 67.
And then San Antonio, was that prior?
That was before
prior?
Minneapolis.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then New York.
Then New York.
Rascal
where
Tad and
I was
everything.
there for 40 years.
Yeah.
Played in the New York City Ballet and freelance concerts and stuff.
Did you have an opportunity to take a lesson when the CSO would come to Carnegie Hall?
Yeah. I think if I could have got one, I would do, but I don't really remember specifically.
Okay.
But I was always going out with them.
Yeah. Well, after concerts.
After concerts, and we'd go. One time we went after a Chicago Symphony concert. Maynard Ferguson band was playing across town somewhere. So a bunch of us, including Jake, went over to whatever jazz club it was, and the band was wailing and wailing. And Jake, he always said he liked jazz and stuff and all, and I'm sure he did. But he was so into his stuff that he'd start these discussions about all these things that we're talking about in totally inappropriate places. Like we were just went there to hear jazz and drink some beer and clap and say, "Hey man, yeah."
He was talking shop.
He'd talk shop. He'd get a couple of people over the corner of the table and with that authoritative tone, we'd look over there and go, "Woo!" And another time, and I'm not making fun of Jake. I love that he was like a father. One time, I was in Chicago, and the LA Philharmonic was in Chicago.
Oh wow!
So Jake and I went up to Roger Bobo's room because Jake wanted to see his. He had I don't know, was it a contrabass trombone or something? I don't know what some kind of weird instrument Roger had. I forget what it was, but he had it with him, and Jake wanted to see it. So we went out and hung out in Roger's room at the hotel, and probably the Chicago Symphony people, or either it must have been Chicago Symphony. Well, but anyway, we came down. Either Jake had to go to play a concert or Roger did, So we left his room and we came down the elevator, and as we came down this elevator, lots of people from the orchestra, whichever it was, got on the elevator. And Roger introduced, must have been in LA, because Roger introduced Jake to a couple of his friends in the orchestra. And one of them, he said something, oh yeah, you're the guy with all the knowledge about breathing and stuff. And in the elevator, he broke into a lecture. And everybody in the elevator was looking around, lifting their eyebrows and going, woo-hoo! You know, there's string players and woodwind players and all that stuff. They didn't know Arnold Jacobs from a hole in the wall necessarily. And it was just a totally inappropriate place to launch into a lecture. Proper answer would have been, yes, I've done a lot of research like that. But he just took off.
He was so excited about
it. He was so excited about his subject and confident of, and he wanted to spread the word, I guess, as well, spread the gospel. And but all the other players in the elevator were just raising their eyebrows. It was pretty funny. Roger and I laughed about it for years after that. But I loved the man. He was great to me. He took me under his wing a little bit. Back in those days, he had me playing. Now, when I started having trouble, when this dystonia thing started creeping in and I didn't know what was going on, I went back from New York several times to try to see what he could do, and he couldn't help. He didn't say that, but he went right to his normal process with people with trouble, and nothing he did really worked for me.
And this was before focal dystonia had been
identified, or at least and so I just wish he had lived longer, because he died before anybody was calling it a syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people that don't believe it really exists too. I know that, and I don't know if they're right or not, but all I know is neurologists believed it. And I'd love to have gotten his scientific mind wrapped around it and taken off and learning about it, because he might have been able to really help if he just had a few more years to study it.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
Because just the way he did study respiratory processes and all this invisible stuff in our bodies, he figured all that out and found a way to articulate some way to get for us to be more efficient. Maybe he could have done some things with the brain stuff too. I don't know.
He was such a master of psychology.
Oh, absolutely.
In his approach to teaching.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you. I really wish there could have been. I was wondering. Well, I wonder what Jacobs would think about that.
Yeah.
You know, dystonia, focal dystonia.
Yeah. He was a blend of a scientist, a musician, and just a nice older man. You know, he really, I think he cared about his students. I think he cared about everyone. And but he was a scientist and a musician, and he somehow blended it in a very efficient and useful way. Some of the scientist types are a little too scientific, they're not artistic enough, and he was all about me. And he never coached me on music. The only time he wanted me to play something a certain way is when I was unsuccessful with something, and he would play it and have me imitate him. Not because he thought I should play it that way, he just wanted to prove that if I had something different in my brain, it'll be better.
So your musicianship was quite acceptable to him?
It seemed to be.
Yeah.
Seemed to be. But he still wanted me to imitate him, but for that other reason.
Yeah, to get you to free yourself up.
He thought that the dystonia thing, because he had this idea that I played a bunch of high notes and stuff all the time. He felt this. A lot of tuba players do that. He felt that a lot of them get themselves in trouble. They get in the high range and they use more pressure and less flow, and they spend too much time there and they don't go down and get into the cash register, shall we say. And it was causing tensions and stuff. And I'm sure he's right and was right about that in a lot of cases. But that wasn't my problem. Because I kept telling him, and I'm not sure he ever quite believed me. I said, but Jake, He said, "You boys, you're playing the high record all the time." And I said, "Jake, I don't really do that. I do it when it's on the page and I have to play it, and I'll practice up there a little bit. I like to play solos and play a recital here and there once in a while. But I'm not just up there squeaking around all the time, you know." And
well, you certainly had great chops all the way around.
well, thank you.
High and
you
low.
know,
That sampler album.
I know people that had better highs and had better lows, but at least the way I've heard it. But I tried to cover all the bases as best I could with my own psychology and what I wanted to do. And I was no Bobo in the high register, and I was no Chester Schmitz at the low register.
What horn were you playing on in the New York Brass Quintet?
What instrument?
Yeah, what tuba?
Well, I started playing with a 184 Miraphone,
Mm-hmm.
which is my first tuba that I owned. And Roger Bobo handed it to me when I was at Eastman. He was working for Miraphone at that time, and I didn't have an instrument. I went to Eastman. I didn't have my own instrument.
Wow.
And they gave me a Miraphone that they had for public school music classes to play on. And so he just handed it to me. He says, "I told him you were going to be good, and I gave you the tuba, and you'll pay for it someday." And that's when I got my first tuba. Roger was into the 184 at that point in time too. So I played in Kemper a couple of years, and I did pay him finally.
That's great.
You know, and then, and I won the Minneapolis job on the audition on that instrument. But I knew that that I'm not going to want to play that instrument in the orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
Matter of fact, when Roger, when I was at Eastman, Roger played it in the Eastman Rochester Orchestra, and he played the hell out of everything because he's so good.
Mm-hmm.
But he had this other tuba called a Heisner, which is a big, warm-sounding German instrument, which I've never heard of before or since. And I used to practice on it once in a while because I liked it so much. But it was Joe Rogers. He didn't play it the whole year. And because all of us tuba players say, "Oh, Roger, play that Heisner. Man, that would sound great." And he was into his 184. But he got me one. And then I experimented around over the years with the Rudy's came out with little bigger instruments. But the first day before I even got to Minneapolis, I bought an old Holton in a shop out in New York, in Walter Sears' shop, because I knew I didn't want to play a Miraphone in the orchestra. So, and it was out of tune, and I had to mess with it. And I ultimately wound up with a York. Found it, sort of a medium size, and which I think was a great instrument. And I had different bells put on it. It had a fur front bell. Well,
B flat, C, E flat.
Oh no, it was a C.
C, okay.
It was always a C. And I traded a Marzan for it. I tried that for a while. He always had a lot of tubas, old tubas and new tubas, and you heard of the Piggy, right? What's called the Piggy?
Absolutely.
Well, he brought the Piggies were they from Czechoslovakia or something?
Yeah, Czechoslovakia.
And I had one of those for a while, and they were very good. He brought those into the United States, and he was basically a recording engineer. His talents on the tuba were quite modest, and he was controversial.
Yeah.
And
I heard all about him from Bob Rusk,
uh-huh.
or at least Bob's take on Walter Sears.
As a matter of fact, I had won the Minneapolis job, and I hadn't left New York yet. And I went to Walter's studio, and he had this Holton, 4/4, I guess you might call it, and it sounded so much better than my Miraphone. Because, like I said, I didn't want to go to Minneapolis and play a Miraphone in the orchestra. And so he let me have it. And so I took it. And I said, I'll pay you. And matter of fact, it got kind of, and I fully intended to pay him, but I still didn't have much money. The orchestra wasn't paying that much. And I was trying to get ahead. I forget how much it cost. And finally, he got in touch with me somehow, and he was kind of ticked at me because he thought I was never going to pay him. And I never thought that I was never going to pay him, but he brought me to realize that, hey, this actually belongs to him. And I walked out of there. He thought I was going to bring it back in a couple of days, and I paid him a year later or something.
I see.
And that's the horn I played in Minneapolis, and even back a little bit when I got back to New York. But
Now you followed Paul Walton in the Minneapolis?
yes,
Okay, and then Ross Tolbert followed you.
he followed me, right.
What do you remember about Paul Walton?
I didn't know him very well. I know he was highly respected as a player in the orchestra, and that was a hard act to follow. And he went into instrument repair and stuff. And he had a whole shop in Minneapolis repairing instruments and stuff. He somehow just got tired of playing, or maybe he was feeling a little stress about it. I can't remember, but I know he was very well liked. Paul was not a real social animal, sort of a tuba player, but very nice and played very nicely. I had never heard of anybody say anything but excellent things about Paul Walton and his playing. And who else did you say?
Steve Chenette, was he playing principal
Steve
trumpet?
Chenette, yes, he was. He was the first trumpet player, and then he moved on he went to Canada to teach, I guess.
In Toronto?
Yeah, Toronto. Yeah. He was the first trumpet. And Mike, who was the second? I can't remember. Can't remember now. God, I can't remember all those people. Wasn't long ago. Well, it was a little bit long ago. Even a while ago, I remember looking on the web to see who's members, because you get the rosters off the web.
Yeah. And
I didn't see anybody I recognized.
all new?
Nobody was there, because I was only about 23 years old when I got the job.
Yeah.
So everybody, I was the baby in the orchestra.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And the bass trombone player the trombone section was absolutely fabulous.
Yeah.
Steve Zellmer, Ron Rickus, and Larry Wyman.
Yeah.
And Larry and I became real good friends, and we carried on and tours and some crazy stuff. And he was just so much fun. He was great.
Well, I certainly appreciate you allowing Emily and I to come up and invade your home and to visit with the Yellowtail.
Very welcome. I don't know. I'm giving you any different information than everybody else gives you.
Everybody has a little bit of different perspective.
Well, I think that's one of the things about Jake. I think Jake treated different people differently because by the way they approached the instrument somehow.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how that would be. He had the same information, but it sounds arrogant, but I think Jake basically liked the way I played music.
Mm-hmm.
So he didn't want to fuss with that. He just wanted me to try to just think it more while I'm doing it.
Yeah.
Rather than, why didn't that turn out right?
Well, yeah, I think with Jacobs, he had individualized curricula for the person. It wasn't a cookie cutter approach.
Right. I think that's one of the aspects that made him so special, because he was smart enough to understand that.
Yeah.
And some people, he said, I make them do like me all day.
Right.
You know, and me, he was specific things.
One of the things I think is, he basically turned a private lesson. It was up to him. It was up to his point. It was do as I say because this is what works for me. To do as I say because this is what works for humans.
Yeah, right.
And he really transformed the whole
Yeah.
private lesson experience, I think.
Well, the only person I know, but he always had some way to help us.
Yeah.
The only person I know that he didn't do anything, Roger Bobo, was on his way to Eastman. Roger Bobo was totally precocious when he was in California. And I don't know if he was on his way to Eastman or something, or on his summer trip, but he was basically in his early years at Eastman. He took a lesson with Jake just to see what's going on. And Jake said, "You're doing fine. I have nothing to teach you."
Yeah.
And I never heard anybody else say that.
Wow.
Jake said that. He certainly didn't say that to me. He patted me on the back, said I was doing good. That's a lot different than, you don't need to come back here anymore because you're doing everything right.
And did Mr. Bobo subsequently return to Jacobs, or was that it?
No, he never went back to it.
Okay.
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
But Roger was
Unbelievable.
unbelievable.
Yeah.
And I got to play duets with him about 3 times a week in his practice studio when he was in Rochester. And I'd go up to the studio and we'd play the Bach double and all kinds of other duets, and I got to sit next to that, hear that playing right in my ear. And boy, that was a huge influence. And I used to tell people, who are your influences? Well, Roger Bobo, the biggest ones are Roger Bobo and Arnold Jacobs. And people would say, wow, they're so different. And they are. But I heard something in both of them. When Jake played, there was a core and a center to the sound that you just knew was absolutely solid. Roger had the same thing.
Yeah.
Even though he played differently musically, he had a different instrument to play on. He liked that buzz in the sound, and Jake wanted do, and Roger wanted But something about the center of it was that efficiency just came right out at me that I saw. And Roger was just a giant as a player.
Yeah, for sure.
How many times did he play something that the first time the rest of us heard it went, oh my God. That first time I heard Craft Encounters, you remember the first time you heard that?
Yeah.
Holy cow! And then, a few years later, quite a few people can play it. Maybe not quite as well as he, but I bet some people did. But not many. But not many.
Yeah. Well, I from in my own history, your voice, Bobo's voice, Jake's voice, Polyphene's voice, and John Fletcher's voice were.
Wow.
Those were all in my mind. So
I'm grateful to be even thought of in the same, spoken of in the same sentence.
Well, with that,
because those are the same, with the exception of my name. There's the same people that are in my head when I mention the ones that I enjoy.
Yeah.
It's
It's so special. Special treat for me to meet you and to spend some time with you. Thank you so much, and
thank you.
We'd like to give you this brand new Tuba People TV edition water bottle, or whatever you want. Chocolate milk.
What about Rebel Yale?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
You know what Rebel Yale is?
No.
It's a cheap bourbon.
Oh, that's why I don't know anything about it. I don't buy the cheap.
You have a little hill, you go, yeah!
No, Thank you, Toby.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And now back to you.